All right, on to the final session of the day. Talking about
Okay.
RGW multi-tenancy. Take it away.
We might have talked about it long time ago. I think we had CDS session, and actually not much has changed since. Uh, the discussion is S3. Well, when we developed the gateway originally, we follow the S3 user module in in which you have one global namespace. Users are created within that namespace. Buckets are also sharing this same namespace. So when you create a bucket, it needs to be unique through the system. And then when we added Swift. Well, at the time, Swift was kind of like using SWAuth, and the notion of tenants was it might existed, but it was hidden very carefully within the interfaces. So when we introduced Swift, we created sub-users, and basically a sub-user is kind of like just a different way to look at the RGW user. So you can have multiple sub-users for a single RGW user. They have a very coarse permission system in which user can have a sub-user inherits all the owning user's rights, but you can limit uh, its operations to do read-only operations or write-only operations, or but basically it's just a different way to access the user. So a user might have multiple sub-users. Each sub-user has its own key, but still they all live in one global namespace, right? So then comes the idea of different tenants. People want to be able to create completely separate applications that don't share the same namespace, each creating their own buckets, uh, having their own names. They don't need to live in one global namespace, which makes sense. So what we propose here is the ability to do just that. We add each RGW user will have a tenant property that it belongs to. Um, the, each bucket will have a tenant property, and all existing users gonna live in the in the global tenant. All new users, if they belong to a different tenant, will inherit that tenant's properties. Um, Buckets will not need to be unique across different tenants. They'll only need to be unique across that tenant. A user could be referenced as a tenant colon user. So um, a user now will be will be referenced through the tenant it belongs to. The same kind of goes to buckets. Probably cannot use the colon uh, character for it for some kind of issues with bucket instance IDs, but that already use the colon character. But um, a bucket will be referenced, could be referenced through the tenant. Now, operations that go on a specific user through a specific user, if the tenant is not specified explicitly, then the user's tenant is gonna be used. So if a user accesses bucket foo, then it and not specifies tenant colon foo, then it is assumed that the user tenant is going to be used. So it implicitly uses the referencing user's tenant. Same goes when a user specifies across. If a user gives permissions to another user in the ACL in the list of ACLs it provides for a specific object or bucket, then it is assumed that the user's tenant is the one that is used in that policy. Let's see. Okay, so how does that play with S3, where we not much needs to change because there's not much that in the gateway that is like a tenant is just a namespace, right? So, but one thing that kind of conflicts with the S3 ways of things is that with S3 you're able to access a specific bucket through going to a virtual host name, right? You specify bucket dot domain, and that brings you to the specific bucket. Now there are a few options to do that now with S3. First of all, is saying, okay, if you go do that, you just go to the global bucket. You cannot access a bucket in a different tenant using that API. That's one option. Another option is being able to specify different domains for different tenants. We can either do it through an entire domain, like bucket.tenant domain 1, bucket.tenant domain 2, or doing it as having this tenant as a subdomain. So say bucket.tenant.domain, and can probably have it configurable. It should, and then users can decide what to do. That's about it for the S3. Let's see if anyone has any questions. Now, that's the basic multi-tenancy functionality. We can extend that. We can once we have that, there are other things that we can add. For example, at the moment, as I described it, the tenant are nothing but kind of a namespace that users have, like some kind of a property that belongs to those users. but we can do stuff and configure stuff at the tenant level. We can say, okay, a tenant would have different storage, specific storage policies that it uses or placement target. We can provide quota by tenants and not by users or globally. The specific tenants might, as I said earlier, might have different DNS entry points for S3 direct access. Or maybe getting statistics about usage at the tenant level. We can do it nowadays if per user if quota is set, but we might have it like happening anyway per user and per tenant, or have some kind of a tenant admins that can administer their users, which is kind of sounds to me like further down the line. I think that's about it. Okay, so Abhishek asking about how will this play out with Keystone. So yeah, well, at the moment, we're mapping Keystone tenants into RGW users, and probably we will have to, once we have that, we will have to either rethink that or keep Keystone mapping into a specific, still keep it into a specific user, depending on how to do that. So either we have two options. One, keep the current mapping. The second one is now map Keystone user into a tenant, and Keystone tenant into RGW tenant, and Keystone user into RGW user. So there are two options. So now Abhishek proposing role-based authentication. You wanna say something, like clarify how that would play?
Is he here? He's limited to typing versus speaking.
Yeah, well, I assume it's something like, users in specific tenants would only have specific permissions, but like read only.
So
Yes, Sage.
I have just a clarifying question. So obviously S3 doesn't have a concept of tenant, and so does all of these changes are only on the Swift side, or would you also add sort of a tenant concept to the S3 API as well?
Everything's gonna be everywhere. It's gonna be included in the S3 and included in Swift. It's not gonna change the API much. If you provide an S3 user reference, it's the reference. If it has a colon in it, it will be assumed that it's using a tenant. It specified a tenant. If it doesn't have it, then it's just specifying the user within the current tenant.
Is colon a disallowed character already?
Think so. And if not, we can make it configurable, which is a character itself. But I think colon, because for colon, we were using it for the sub-user.
Right. So it's along a similar vein on the with the DNS name thing. Was dot an allowed character previously?
Dot within a bucket name, no.
Because then, without breaking compatibility, we can just add foo.bar.domain or whatever can be
right.
Bucket foo tenant bar.
Right. We can do that. We can either make the tenant as a subdomain or have per tenant domains, or have both.
Will this break the existing sub users? because they're also using colon. This would basically be throwing out the sub-user concept and
I
instead,
would
or?
love to throw away the sub-user concept. Yeah, we need to think about it. A sub-user concept is a broken one. It was a hack that shouldn't have, I think. But people are using it, so we might want to keep it. Yeah, we can think of a different character, not a colon, if that's a problem. A slash, backslash.
It would be interesting to hear from current people who have it deployed, who are using Swift, how attached they are and how disruptive it would be if we got rid of it.
The thing is that there is who are actually using S3 with sub-users, which kind of an accident because it wasn't really supposed to be working with S3. But the thing with sub-users is that you are able to create to give users different keys into the same data, and actually that's kind of still gonna be different from Swift, right? Because in Swift, under the same tenant, all the users that you create share the same data. In S3, it's not the case, and it's not gonna change. So maybe sub-users still make some fill up some necessity. Abhishek said about tenant subdomains for OpenStack cases, this becomes a UUID. Well, I'm not sure what the question is asking. The tenant, the current, or really long URIs.
Does it mean that in practice the tenant name in Swift is a UUID and not a normal string?
Well, we can decide on that. In Swift, the tenant names are kind of like a UID, and they have a name. So you have a tenant ID and a tenant name, and the tenant name describes it. It's kind of like, and we should probably have some kind of similar mechanism, but on the other hand, there is a we were kind of user friendly in which we kept using the user names rather than the user than some kind of 128 character or 32 character random hex string. But on the other hand, it poses some issues, like if you want to reference different user instances, like you created the user, you removed the user, then you create it again, and there's no difference in the new user than the old one, right? Your reference is the same. We used to have the same issue with bucket names, and that was solved for dumpling when we introduced the bucket instance. And so maybe having some kind of a user instance and tenant instance is the way to go forward, the correct way to go forward. Yeah, it's a good point.
All right, was there anything else?
So I guess the question for me is always like what the next step is to move forward with this, because we've talked about it several times, and it seems to come down to at least for me, not knowing very much about what people who are using sort of RGW for Swift API are actually hitting and how much whether this sort of fits their compatibility needs or whatever, and then also how much we're going to break things if we drop sub-users. But I'm not sure how to get that feedback.
Well,
I mean, is it just that, or is it just your time? That's.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a few options, and one of the options is don't break anything. If you with just selecting different kind of a character, you probably don't break anything, and maybe that's I committed something almost 2 years ago. Don't remember the issue name and the branch name. It starts with 5, so it's kind of an old one. And I looked at a few weeks ago into resurrecting that and got most of it already applied. And that would make most of phase 1. So it's currently implementation-wise, it's not a very complicated issue if you don't do all the extra stuff. And the extra stuff is not, it just touches the peripherals. It's not anything very complicated. But as for user stories, that I did have discussions with some users, and this plan seemed fair. No one was really concerned about, unless someone else wants to chime in now and say what they think. I think it's something that should probably have anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, probably it seems to me like it's going to mostly come down to like testing, right? There's the initial effort
definitely.
to get your stuff sort of in shape or whatever and updated, but then having a test suite that actually exercises the namespace both on the Swift side and on the S3 side to make sure that it actually makes sense.
Right.
And that's like, unfortunately, that tends to require attention to detail, which is hard when this is one item in a long list of other stuff you have to get done.
Right. Yeah. Testing is 60%, 70% of the work, if not 90. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe we seem to be getting more patches than usual with fixing Swift compatibility issues. So maybe if one of those contributors is interested in sort of spearheading that effort, that would be helpful.
Right. Yep, definitely. Well, the branch is up there. I can, if anyone wants to pick it up, I can point them at that and give guidelines.
Cool. Okay. Sounds good to me.
All right. Does that bring it to a close here, does it?
Sounds like it.
Standing.
So.
All right.